The topic for today is period forms. This is a continuation, or the next step after you understand cadences. We can then start talking about phrase structures and periods. What I'm going to be giving you right now is just the theoretical framework for understanding. What you really then need to do to practice this and understand it is apply it to actual written, composed music and be able to analyze. So these are the tools that you will use to name formal structures in music you analyze. So that's outside of the scope of what we're going to be covering right now. Right now we're just giving you the vocabulary to analyze the formal structure in music you might listen to or analyze or look at. So the first thing is to talk a little bit more about the word phrase. A phrase is often 4 measures in length. It's a musical unit. It's a melody. That ends in a cadence. So, a cadences, as we know, we have many options. We could have a perfect, authentic cadence, an imperfect, authentic cadence, a half cadence. Those are the main 3. We also have deceptive cadence, plagal cadence, all those. But perfect, authentic, imperfect, authentic, and half cadence are the ones that we hear and see the most often. So we're just going to put those up there right now. A phrase is a unit. You can say, sometimes you can combine phrases into a larger unit. Sometimes you can combine them into a larger unit. When you can, they're called a period. Not all phrases can be combined into larger units. When they can't, and you have a phrase and then you have another phrase 1, phrase 2, it might be a repeated phrase. So this S here that I wrote means strong. So this is a strong cadence at the end of phrase 1, followed by a strong cadence at the end of phrase 2. When you have that, you are talking about repeated phrases, not a period. The idea of a period is almost like a question-answer type structure. To have a question-answer structure, you would need to have a weaker cadence followed by a stronger cadence. So question, answer. So typically a repeated phrase would have a perfect authentic cadence, and then the next phrase would have another perfect authentic cadence. There's nothing stronger than a perfect authentic cadence. So when you have 2 of them in a row, you can't really combine it into a larger question and answer period structure. You just label it repeated phrases. Again, we're talking very abstractly right now because we're not looking at sheet music and saying, right there, look at that cadence, look at that cadence. What I'm trying to do right now is give you the terminology that you can then use when you look at sheet music. So, how do we get a period? We have a phrase, a first phrase, that has a weaker cadence, followed by another phrase, a second phrase, that has a stronger cadence. So, weaker could be either imperfect, authentic, or half cadence. So half cadence is always a weak cadence. Perfect authentic is always a strong cadence. This is in between, the imperfect authentic cadence. It's in between. So it could go either way. If my first phrase ends with a half cadence, let's say, you then say, well, phrase 2 has to end in a stronger cadence. You actually have 2 options. It could be imperfect authentic cadence or a perfect authentic cadence. You have an option. If this first phrase ends in an imperfect authentic cadence, that's weaker than a perfect authentic cadence. So your weak cadence is either going to be a half cadence or an imperfect authentic cadence. Both of those are options for the end of a phrase. Whatever happens in phrase 2 has to be a stronger cadence than what you had at the end of phrase 1. So again, I'll say it again. If you had a half cadence, You could go to an imperfect authentic cadence or a perfect authentic cadence. Both of those are stronger. If phrase 1 ends in an imperfect authentic cadence, you have to end phrase 2 in a perfect authentic cadence, because that's the only one that's stronger. And then what happens is phrase 1 functions like a question, and phrase 2 functions like an answer. So that means that you have a period. Now it doesn't tell you what kind of period. So the period structure is determined by the cadences. A weak to strong cadence structure. That's what gives you a period. What kind of period, whether it is parallel or contrasting, deals with the material in the exact phrase. So if you say, phrase 1, we're going to call it A, which is what we typically call one of anything. We give it a letter. Phrase 2, in this case, I wrote A with a symbol here, which is called prime. What that means is it's the same material, and the prime means with some variation. But it's the same material as we had here. When phrase 1 and phrase 2 have related material, particularly at the beginning of the phrase. Let me say that again because that's important. When phrase 1 and phrase 2 have the same or very similar material at the beginning of the phrase, we call that a parallel period. When phrase 1 and phrase 2 are different, we call it a contrasting period. So, to review again, a period is determined by the cadence structure, weak, strong. The type of period, parallel or contrasting, is determined by the relationship of the phrases. If they're similar, it's parallel. If they're different, it's contrasting. I'd like to play for you a little audio example on a CD of exactly what a parallel period would sound like. So, in this case, our parallel period sounds like this. So listen to this. That's our cadence for phrase 1. Phrase 2. It starts the same way, very similar. But if you listen carefully, you can hear that it ends in a perfect authentic cadence. So we had a 4-measure phrase ending in a half cadence, followed by a phrase that started off very, very similar, that ended in a perfect authentic cadence. You can say that entire 8 measures is a parallel period. And so what you will often be asked to do is analyze music. So you'll be given a score, piano, voice, orchestra, string quartet, and they'll say mark the phrases, label the cadences, and indicate period structures. So, again, the things that you'll be asked to do. I'm going to erase this right here. You'll be asked to mark phrases, identify cadences, and label periods. And you have to do that all by looking at the music and looking for the types of things that we are talking about now, and knowing what the appropriate label is. So, we talked about parallel period, we talked about contrasting period. Let's listen to an example of a contrasting period, just to hear what that is.
Example 10:14.
Half cadence. Cadence, right there. And that where's where we have our perfect authentic cadence. So that was phrase 1 with a half cadence. Phrase 2 with a perfect authentic cadence. And the phrases were different. Let's listen to it again.
Example 10:14.
So the beginnings of both of those phrases is different. This one starts with an ascending scale. This one has more of a dotted, a quarter eighth note rhythmic structure. So when you're analyzing, you can just often just look at the rhythmic structure first, and then look at the contour of the melody to see whether there's a similarity or a difference. When there's a difference, we're talking about a contrasting period. Now, sometimes things fall into something called a three-phrase period. This is where things get significantly more complicated as you analyze. You have a phrase, and a phrase. And we need to use the words antecedent and consequent. So antecedent means the phrase that comes first, consequent, second, the consequence. And what's tricky is what happens with phrase 2. So phrase 2 could either be another antecedent phrase or another consequent phrase. The most common is where you have antecedent, consequent. So it's almost like question, answer, which would mean phrase in terms of cadence, half cadence, usually a perfect authentic cadence, or possibly an imperfect authentic cadence. So weak, strong. Because if we go weak, you can't call that a period. If we just looked at this, phrase 1, half cadence, phrase 2, half cadence, we couldn't call that a period, because a period by definition has to have a weaker cadence followed by a stronger cadence. So you could say, well, 2 half cadences, maybe we're talking about a repeated phrase. But usually when we talk about repeated phrases, we're talking about strong. In this case, at some point, we're going to have something that's strong. So if you go half cadence, strong, what happens is it doesn't sound like 2 repeated phrases and then this one phrase that's all by itself. It then sounds like this one large structure, a 3-phrase period. So that makes it even more challenging when you're looking at music and you look and say, here's a phrase, what's the cadence, right? Because again, what's the phrase, what's the cadence, can I make it into a period? And you might be like, I can't make this into a period. Then you have to say, is this a repeated phrase? Is it a larger structure, like a 3-phrase group? Or something even more complicated, which we'll talk about shortly. So let's listen. I have an example of this for you. That's a 3-phrase period. Listen closely.
Example 10:15.
Half cadence right here. Half cadence here. And a perfect authentic cadence at the end. So that would be an example from Mozart of a 3-phrase period. And in this case, because it was both half cadences, it's antecedent, consequent. Now, what happens if you get something that's like this? Phrase 1 ends in a half cadence, phrase 2 a half cadence, phrase 3 a half cadence, and then finally you get a perfect authentic cadence. Then we get into something called the double period. And here, we're talking about 4 phrases that then get grouped together. The first 2 phrases get called the antecedent. So you combine those first two phrases, call that the antecedent. You combine the second two, or phrases 3 and 4, to call that the consequent. And then you look particularly at the cadences at the end of phrase 2 and the cadence at the end of phrase 4. And like we've said with our other periods, half cadence can go to either a perfect authentic cadence or imperfect authentic cadence. And an imperfect authentic cadence at the end of phrase 2 can only go to perfect authentic cadence. How do you know that it's a double period versus a single period? Well, you don't have, you have weak, 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 and then finally strong. I guess theoretically, you could just keep going weak, 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 until you eventually get to a strong, and that's all going to get lumped together. But there's kind of a limit on how much the human mind can hold at once. Like, if you do 100 half cadences in a row, chances are your entire audience is lost. It doesn't matter that you go to a perfect authentic cadence at cadence 101. No one's going to be like, oh yes, I hear that as one large unit. But we can definitely hear 4 phrases that get lumped together into one larger unit, that larger unit being called the double period. Here, just like the regular period, the double period is either parallel or contrasting. And just like we use that same ideas, if the antecedent phrase is related to the consequent phrase, it's called parallel. And if it isn't, then it's called contrasting. And in this case, when you're determining that, you're looking at the antecedent and consequent. You're not looking at phrase 1, phrase 2 for a double period to determine parallel or contrasting. You're looking at the antecedent and the consequent. So let me play for you an example of what this would sound like, a parallel double period.
Example 10:16.
Half cadence. Half cadence, end of antecedent phrase. Half cadence again. Now listen to how satisfying this is. Finally, you get that perfect authentic cadence. And all of those phrases get kind of wrapped up in a nice bow in terms of how it sounds. And this is why we use that terminology of saying, oh wow, that's really important. Look at how Beethoven took these 4 phrases and kind of like put them all together, and they hold together because of the way those cadence structures function as a larger unit. Now, again, this is all very abstract. It's best when you look at actual sheet music and examples of this. Even harder and more challenging to understand is the concept of sentence structure. So a sentence structure applies to a larger phrase. So we're not talking about a period. A sentence is more of a kind of phrase. So I'm going to write phrase here. Because it starts and it ends in a cadence. And it could be any kind of cadence. Half cadence, imperfect authentic cadence, perfect authentic cadence. So a sentence is kind of like a subcategory of phrase. It's a specific kind of phrase. What makes a sentence is that it starts with often a motive. And a motive is it's not long enough to be a phrase, not extensive enough to be a melody. It's more of a fragment of a melody that has a certain rhythmic, melodic shape. So for example, when Beethoven played that's his motive that he then repeated, and then repeated again, and repeated again, and then repeated again. And when you put it all together, you get a phrase. But the idea of, as a motive usually ends up being 5 to maybe 7 notes in length, somewhere in that area. And so what you do is you start with a motive. We call it X. You then take that same motive and vary it. Therefore, we call that X prime. So again, this is the motive again. But like Beethoven did, you play it higher, you play it lower, you vary it in some way. And then after that, the rest of the phrase moves towards a cadence in some way. Now, often, when we say move to a cadence, we're talking about a bunch of fast notes. Very typical when we're analyzing a phrase to be a sentence. So again, here we're talking about phrase 1, phrase 2, phrase 1. We're talking about periods and how phrases come together. When we're talking about a sentence, we're just talking about one of these phrases and how that phrase can be made up of a motive followed by the variation of that motive and then motion towards a cadence. Let's listen to an example of that.
Example 10:17.
And that would be a perfect
Example 10:18.
You have the bum bum ba ba dum bum bum. Repeat bum bum ba ba dum bum bum. Bunch of fast notes. Motive, variation of motive, fast notes, motion towards a cadence. So right here you now have all the terminology that you need to talk about formal structures at the phrase level and grouping them phrases together into periods, whether they're 2 phrase periods, 3 phrase periods, or in the case of a double period, a 4 phrase period. All right, go forth and analyze. Thank you.